Hello, Savvy Startup students. Welcome to this latest edition of our video series. This is going to be on legal considerations, and it's going to be a little bit different than what we've done so far. So far, we've been talking about what are the things that you need to know as you start your business. Now we're going to talk about maybe things that are, I guess, what I would characterize as a little more advanced. This is what's called additional asset protection planning. Now, the reason I've kind of saved this one for later on in the series is because this one is not as vitally important that you get it in place right from the beginning. You see, as your business gets up and going and you're moving, shaking, making things happen, that means that you're in a growth mode. Well, not only is your business growing, but your need for asset protection is growing at the same time. So I want you to understand that growth requires growth. So growth in your business requires growth in your overall plan. And that is exactly what we're going to be talking about. Now, once again, I'm attorney JJ Childers from Advanced Tax Group, and joining us on this lesson is going to be Tony Dixon, tax expert from Advanced Tax Group. Tony, it's great to have you with us.
As always, it's always great to share some space and time and training with you, JJ. I always find myself learning something new every time I'm here with you.
Well, I think the students are going to learn this same thing as well. And that's where this is let me just give a reminder. Don't look at this particular lesson as something that you have to work your way, from start to finish with all of our lessons sequentially. No, look at this particular lesson just like any other lesson and say, hey, you know what? This is a resource. Maybe I need to take a look at this and then look at it again, because this is not going to be a one and done. This is going to be one of those that you're going to come back and seek guidance from on an ongoing basis. So let's take a look at what we're going to be talking about in this particular lesson. Now, let me give you that overview. First of all, we're going to talk about the threats to your wealth building efforts. As I mentioned, as you are growing this business, as it begins to grow, so will your need for additional protection. So will your need for making sure that you have addressed threats that really weren't there before. Now, as your business is growing, you've got more to protect. Well, let me just tell you, that means more work, but that's a good thing, because the entire point of us starting this business was for it to thrive and become successful. So that is where the more successful you are, the more you have at risk of potentially losing. What we want to do is make sure that we can implement strategies to ensure that you don't lose all that you worked so hard to accumulate. And that's what the focus is of this particular lesson. So we talk about, as I mentioned, the threats to your wealth building efforts, but then we're going to talk about asset protection. We're going to get into tax reduction. And then we're going to talk about something that you may be thinking, how is this even tied to business? Well, at the end of the day, everything is about making sure that you pass on as much of your wealth as possible to your heirs and beneficiaries. Typically, that's going to be your family, your children, your grandchildren. So we want to make sure that this business lasts longer than just you. And the fruits of your labor can be passed on, and you can create generational wealth. That is all about what we refer to as entity structuring. You see, the key is, you may recall in one of our previous lessons, I talked about choosing your legal structure. And that was, how are we going to structure this business? Is it going to be, a sole proprietorship? Is it going to be a partnership? Is it going to be a limited liability company? Is it going to be a corporation? And if so, it's going to be an S corporation. Well, those are all great for determining our core business. However, what happens is, as you grow, you start adding in additional things. Maybe now you're not renting an office or working out of your house. Maybe you've bought an office building, and now you need a different entity for that office building. And then you've got equipment. You may need a different legal entity just to own the equipment and lease it back to your business. What we are doing is we're implementing advanced additional structures to make sure that we're able to deal with your advancing wealth building efforts. So with that, let's kind of take a look at the threats, as I mentioned before. Now, first of all, anytime I'm speaking with a group, whether it's on a webinar or one of the live seminars that we conduct, or even now it may just be on the phone and I talk with people, I always say, here's what we have to factor in. You see, I believe the government and other sources out there are attempting to place what I call a lid on wealth. Now, by lid, that's an acronym for the three legal pitfalls, the three major threats that we're dealing with, and those are lawsuits, income taxes, and death taxes. Now, I'm not going to get into great detail here, but let's just take a look at a couple of things that you need to know about with regard to each of these. First of all, lawsuits. Studies have shown that there's a new lawsuit filed on average in this country every 30 seconds. So if you think about that, that's a lot of people being sued. Now, another thing that people want to factor in is 1 out of every 4 people will be sued each and every year. Now, I just want you to kind of think about that for a second. 1 out of every 4 people will be sued each and every year. Now, here's the deal. That sounds like a lot of people, but it's even worse than it sounds initially, because when we say 1 out of every 4 people, that's factoring in infants, toddlers, children, the elderly, the homeless. That's factoring in some people that they're not ever going to get sued. So if we're saying 1 out of every 4, that's taking an average. What that means is that some people are being sued far more often than are other people. Well, guess who gets sued a lot? Business owners. Now, I know that's not exciting news to you, but what I want to make sure that you understand is that's why you have us as part of your team. You see, what we do with people is we help them to implement strategies to protect against these lawsuits. And we're going to talk about that in greater detail in just a moment, but I just want to make sure that you understand the threat that we're dealing with. But then on top of that, we have income taxes. Now, here's where I think this becomes a little more near and dear to your heart, and that is when I say 1 out of every 4 people will be sued each and every year, well, guess what? 4 out of every 4 people who generate income will be subjected to income taxes each and every year. Now, that makes it a little more pressing because it's something that it's not if this happens. Oh, you know it's happening. So we've got to make sure that we have strategies. And as your income begins to grow, as that business begins to grow, you're going to be making more money. Well, that's what our objective is. But at the same time, if we make more money, we're now going to be subjected to additional taxes. Well, I have good news for you. There are strategies that you can implement that will significantly reduce, if not eliminate, certain taxes. How does that sound? You see, now we have to implement additional structures, additional strategies, and additional systems. And that's what we're going to be kind of culminating all of this information into a focus on that entity structuring in just a moment as well. So I want to make sure that you know where we're going, but we have to appreciate and identify these threats. And then the final one of our lid illustration is death taxes. Again, I say 1 out of every 4 people will be sued each and every year. Guess what? 4 out of every 4 people will die. Now, that's not necessarily the motivational part of this video, but it's something that we all have to appreciate and we all have to respect. We all have to take into consideration because at some point we're all going to die. And one of the things that I've really encountered in working with so many small business owners over the years is that I always ask them, why are you doing this? And, you'll have some people that say, because I want to make money. And then you have some people that say, just because I love it. And then probably the biggest response that I get and the biggest group is the people that say, you know what, I want to build something to leave behind for my family. Well, I appreciate that. And it motivates me to say, hey, you know what? I've got to make sure that I help them to leave behind as much as possible to their families. So we've got to implement some additional strategies over and above what we've talked about thus far in the Savvy Startup series. So that's why when I say this is additional asset protection planning, this is going to be a little more advanced, at least, the consideration of these strategies. Now, again, we're not going to get into exhaustive detail by any means. I'm just going to introduce you to what you need to be thinking about as you progress through your overall career and through your overall business endeavors and efforts. All right.
I love this list, like the three major the threats to your wealth. And every time you share this, it resonates so deeply with me and our clients. And I know it's not on your list, but it's almost like we could almost add one more, which would be inaction. Because one of the biggest threats that our clients face is the mentality that they're going to do it once, like set it and forget it. And that, like, do it once, set up the entities once, identify your tax strategy once, set up your estate plan once, and then you're good for the rest of your life. And that's kind of like going to the gym once and doing one set of crunches and then expecting a six pack abs for the rest of your life. And you touched on this. There's things change, things evolve as businesses grow. The plan needs to grow and change with it as well. as you grow, your tax strategy needs to change. As you add assets, your estate plan needs to change. And so I love these threats. And one thing I always try to echo to our clients is, hey man, this is going to be an ever evolving, ever changing process. As you are changing, as your business is changing, you need to adapt with it along the way.
Yeah, and that's a great point. It's kind of what, I actually mention this a lot of times when I'm talking with clients or prospective clients, and I try to educate them. I say, one of the biggest challenges you've got is making sure you don't fall into what I refer to as the vaccination theory of protection planning. And that vaccination, just as you kind of referenced, Tony, is basically people treat this like they do their measles vaccine or their polio vaccine. They say, you know what, I was vaccinated for this, so I don't ever have to worry about it ever again. Well,
Yeah.
that's not how asset protection works. I mean, we put in place very specific structures for specific situations. Well, as your situation changes, the specifics have also changed. That means that your structure has to change. Now, it doesn't mean that you have to scrap the old and then replace it with a new. Not at all. What this is almost saying, hey, we're going to add on to the foundation that we've built. We're going to build upon that foundation and take things to the next level. So that's a great point, Tony. And here's where I want to make sure that we all understand how we're doing this. Because when you're working with a professional, you need to make sure that you understand what it is you're asking them for their advice on, or what area are you seeking their wisdom in making sure that they provide you with the right information that you need. So to deal with each of these, basically the solutions to the threats, when we're dealing with lawsuits, that's asset protection. Asset protection really could be used as an all-encompassing term because asset protection is about the protection of assets. From what? From lawsuits, from income taxes, from death taxes. But for our purposes, we're going to speak specifically about asset protection. So that's something that we're going to touch on, but I'm going to introduce you all these first before we get into the individual components. When it comes to income taxes, that's what we mean when we say, okay, we've got to focus on tax reduction efforts. And that requires planning. It's not just tax preparation. A lot of times people mistakenly believe, oh no, I have a tax preparer. Well, preparing the taxes, all that means is you provided something to them, they took it based on what you gave them, they put something out. Well, guess what? Garbage in, garbage out. You've got to be mindful of that there's a lot more that goes into the initial process, the planning. So we're going to talk about that a little bit as well. And then finally, the death taxes. What we're dealing with here is estate planning. Now, a lot of times people think estate planning, I'll deal with that down the road. I'm still young. I don't have to worry about that. Well, guess what? People pass away all the time before their average life expectancy. So we've got to make sure, hey, we hope for the best, but we plan for the worst. That's where we always have to implement certain strategies. And all of this by focusing on asset protection, tax reduction, and estate planning, that all comes into the overall process of entity structuring. And that means that we are integrating various entities for different purposes because there may be some strategies that I teach that I say this strategy is tremendous for asset protection, but it doesn't lower your taxes by 1 red cent. And at the same time, there may be something that's tremendous for reducing your taxes, but it doesn't do anything for protecting your assets. Well, does that mean that one of these is good and one of these is bad? No, what we need is a blending of those strategies together, and that's what entity structuring is all about. So when we talk about this in particular, with regard to some of the things that we get into, let's first of all, Tony, I'm going to kind of start things off, but I want to get your input just on some of the experience that you've had working with our clients too, especially what it is that maybe some of the challenges that they have, and maybe some of the obstacles that they raise to us that we overcome. So I'm going to share some of them, but I'm going to have you kind of plus me on some of these things. Does that sound good?
Sounds like a plan.
All right, let's make it happen. So first of all, when we talk about asset protection, as I mentioned, this is about dealing with lawsuits. Well, the biggest thing that I see people make the mistake in is basically thinking that they're protected and they're really not. Because like Tony said, he basically, people look at this and they say, okay, I'm set it and forget it. Don't have to worry about this ever again. Well, that's not the case. You may have made that initial choice as far as getting your entity put in place. And let's just say it's a limited liability company. Because as I mentioned, far and away, that's probably the most popular option. But now let's take a look at what happens there, or really what that means. You see, I tell people all the time, if you have no legal entity, you have no limited liability, that means all of your assets are at risk. Well, we don't want that to be the case. So then we say, all right, well, let's choose a structure that can limit our liability. So how about a limited liability company? Well, it's a great choice, great option, great decision that you made. However, let's break it down. A limited liability company means your liability is limited to the entire company. Now, when you're first starting, that sounds great because you say, okay, I want the liability limited to my company. I don't want it to spill over to my personal assets because that's the primary thing you're protecting. However, as that business grows, now you've got a lot more to lose. So when I say that your liability is limited to the entire company, that doesn't sound very good because that means your entire company's eggs are in one basket. If something happens to that basket, boom, you've lost all your eggs. So we've got to make sure that we divide things up. So there could be things, I've made reference to that illustration earlier where I said, you may be buying an office building for yourself, for your business. Well, that building should be in a completely separate legal entity. And then maybe that legal entity leases the office space to your primary entity. Then there may be different equipment that you have, or it could be software that you use. It could be maybe some sort of proprietary information that you have. Well, what we'll even do in situations like that is we'll set up the proprietary intellectual property, if you will, in its own entity, and then we have a licensing agreement between the owner of the intellectual property and the actual business. Now, some of you may be getting confused right now, and that's okay, especially if you're just starting a business. I get it. The reason I'm mentioning all of this to you is because if you're following some of the strategies that we're sharing with you in this whole Savvy Startup, odds are you're going to be more successful than you would be otherwise. That's why we're here. That's why we're doing this. That's why we've made this available to you. So as you grow, you're going to need to make sure that your team grows along with you. That's what we do. We not only do we set people up at the beginning, but we help follow them along their careers because it doesn't mean we're done with them. Doesn't mean you're done with us. It means no. As part of your team, we've got to grow along with you. And that's what this asset protection is all about, is making sure that you can assess the potential threats and then devise a plan so that you can make sure that you implement strategies to isolate and insulate. Now, that isolation and insulation basically means we isolate assets and activities into separate legal entities so that we can insulate those assets and activities from our other assets and activities. Now, I know that was a mouthful, so let me kind of break it down and tell you again. Isolation and insulation. Basically, it means we isolate assets and activities into their own legal entities so that those assets and activities are insulated from any potential liability of our other assets and activities. Now, translation is we don't want to put all our eggs in one basket. What we want to do is make sure that we identify what are our eggs and how can we divide them up into different baskets. Again, that's the assets and activities, divide them up into different legal entities. That's where we get the asset protection. One of the things that I always say is there's a strategy called divide and conquer. Well, what we're talking about here is divide to keep from being conquered. So that's exactly what we're doing. Tony, what have you seen with regard to some of this? Because I know you talk to a lot of clients, and I know while you focus primarily on the tax aspect of things, we're always dealing with all of these areas.
Absolutely. And you bring up an excellent point with the divide to not be conquered, and to add to this whole concept that you're sharing, one of the biggest pitfalls that we run into is the idea of, it's kind of a twofold, is one of the lack of use of the entity or entities, and then the commingling of entities. And so what we see a lot of times is people will come in and they'll set up that first business. Maybe it's an LLC or a partnership. So they'll set it up. They'll get the tax ID number. They'll get, they'll go through the process of getting all their legal paperwork set up, the operating agreement, which we've talked about on all of these previous videos within this course. But then they'll call us up 6 months from now, and they'll say, hey, well, I've got a question about these expenses. We'll be like, all right, well, let's talk about that. Let's dive into that. And they're still running their expenses through a personal bank account. So they haven't actually set up the business bank account, or they did, but they weren't using it. And so there's now this blending of personal finance into the business. And so they haven't fully engaged in using the business the way they meant to. And so when you commingle funds like that, you're only hurting yourself and preventing yourself from being able to use the entity to do what it was meant to do, which was create separation and protection. And then same thing happens when they start setting up additional businesses, because as they start breaking off the second, the third, the fourth business, because, like you'd mentioned, they may have this idea for marketing, and then another idea to sell a product, and then another idea to offer this service. And they may say, well, I've got this entity, I'm going to put them all in the same thing. Well, that's all your eggs in one basket. And so as they begin to break off separate businesses, each one of those businesses producing money should have its own business bank account, and separating the funds out. Every dollar is important, and it has to be assigned to a specific activity or asset or business. And so the challenge that we see a lot of clients, or the mistake that we see people making all the time, is just having them all run through the same place. And in their mind, they're different businesses, but according to the government or the IRS, it all kind of looks the same unless you're truly separating them out.
And that's the key you just mentioned truly separating them out. One thing that I would just kind of, I don't know, I really just want to share this with you is that I know this can seem overwhelming. What I would tell you, look at me, don't be overwhelmed, okay? Because what I'm telling you is that this is different, but it's not necessarily difficult, okay? It doesn't have to be difficult, but it is going to be different. And I get it. A lot of times when people are trying different things, it can be difficult. I understand that. But that's why you have us here with you. And not only just here in this video series, if you need additional assistance, we're here for you there as well. So make sure to reach out to us and let us know how we might be able to be of assistance to you. So let's take a look at our next point that I want to kind of touch on, and that is tax reduction. And it may seem like, why would I say I don't want to have certain tax strategies? I want every tax strategy I could possibly have. Well, the reality is you may not need every possible tax strategy right now. And a lot of strategies won't be available to you initially because maybe you're not there. When you're first starting your business, your objective is to bring in more money than you have in expenses. Well, those expenses are going to be tax deductible under Section 162 of the tax code, because under Section 162 of the tax code, all ordinary and necessary business expenses are deductible. Now, when you hear that term ordinary and necessary, that sounds pretty vague, which we love the fact that it sounds vague, because who determines what's ordinary and necessary for your business? You do. Now, do you have to be reasonable? Shake your head like this. Yes, you have to be reasonable, because if you're not reasonable with this, somebody else is going to determine what's ordinary and necessary. And my guess is they're not going to be quite as reasonable. So be sure that you are reasonable when you're making these decisions as to, am I going to deduct this or am I not? But early on, all of your ordinary and necessary business expenses are going to be deductible. So that's going to offset a lot of your income. However, as you continue to grow that business and become more successful in that business, you're going to have more income and not necessarily the same corresponding expenses. So now you've got additional income that's going to be taxed if you don't do something to reduce those taxes. That's where additional strategies, additional structures, and additional tactics become very important to making sure that we preserve as much of your income as possible, so that now you can continue to parlay that into your business for even more and more wealth building efforts. So tax reduction is vitally important, but I just want to make sure. Sometimes people say, hey, I want to know every tax strategy I can. Well, some tax strategies are essentially irrelevant for you until you get to a certain point. Like maybe stocking aside money for a retirement plan. That's going to be something that can be tremendous. And if I told somebody, hey, I can show you how to put aside, $30,000 in a retirement plan, You may say, hey, that's great, but guess what? My business netted 25 last year, so I kind of need that. I don't want to put every bit of it into a retirement plan. I'm saying, I get that. And then there are going to be other strategies where you say, okay, I could maybe have an extra $14,000 this year, but maybe you don't have that much of a need for that. And then there are certain strategies such as, hey, here's how you can pay your kids. Well, that's great, except what if you don't have kids? So the point I want to make here is that this is a relationship that you need to have with your tax team. It's something that you need to be doing. It's not just, as I mentioned, the whole just tax preparation. There needs to be planning. And planning should occur before you ever generate the income. That sounds strange to a lot of people because they look at it and they say, well, I tell you what, once I make the money, then I'll figure out how I'm going to reduce my taxes. And that's backwards. We've got to make sure we have a plan for how we even receive our income from the very beginning, because different types of income are taxed differently. There's some income that is subject to FICA, which is the Social Security and Medicare taxes. There's some of it that's not subject to FICA. Depending upon how you structure your business, you can avoid having to pay the FICA taxes. So there are additional strategies. The other thing is maybe adding in a C corporation. One of the beauties of a C corporation is that it is a separate tax-paying entity, which means it doesn't have personal tax brackets. It's subject to the corporate tax bracket. So you may be in a position as an individual taxpayer that you're receiving income and now you're at a higher tax bracket. Well, if you shift some of that money over to a C corporation, it's like you have a brand new fresh start. So that C corporation may be at a lower overall tax bracket, and then may have corporate qualified retirement plans that can be very beneficial to you as well. But that's not something we start with. We grow into that, and you've probably heard me say on other lessons, a saying that I have quite regularly is, don't go into it, grow into it. And this is going to be part of that overall process. It's not just tax preparation, it's tax planning. And then that's not just put a plan in place and be done with it. No, as your overall business environment, circumstances, situation changes, your plan will need to change along with that. Tony, what would you kind of add here?
Yeah, you've done a great job in covering this, and coming back to this theme of the threat of taxes. When you're looking at entity structuring and asset protection, this is something that can affect your wealth in one event. One devastating lawsuit can take a lot of your wealth very quickly. When it comes to taxes is like the death by 1,000 cuts, or the frog that slowly gets boiled and the heat just gradually grows and he doesn't even notice. We are slowly bleeding our wealth out every single year. We're not paying attention to the amount we pay in taxes. And so exactly what you're teaching here, JJ, is how do we turn that heat down when we're in this pot of boiling water, so we're not cooking ourselves. We're slowing that process of our wealth slowly bleeding out through taxes. And you talked about planning. When you look at, like, for example, in sports, some of the best teams out there, the ones that win championships and go all the way, they're watching videos of their competitors. They're preparing for the game before the game even happens. They're saying, hey, this is who we're going up against. This is what they will probably be doing against us and how we're going to respond to it. And so in taxes, it's very similar. It's almost like you're going up against the IRS and you need to know what their game plan is and how they respond, so you can plan and prepare how money's going to flow in and out of your business, so you can keep more of it and find yourself being the winner at the end of the day.
Well, that kind of got a little graphic there, Tony. I mean, we were talking about death by 1,000 cuts, being boiled in boiling water. This is sounding like a horror film. Then you throw in the IRS, the biggest boogeyman of all. Oh my gosh, we may have to put a warning at the front of this video for people watching this. That's how it seems a lot of times, is that this has become just this nightmare situation. And I've got to shoot you straight, as I always do. Hey, it can be nightmarish if you don't do it the right way. Well, that's part of the reason we make these videos. That's part of the reason we do what we do at Advanced Tax Group, is help people to identify those threats. It's almost like there's a minefield that you're walking your way through, and to make sure that you don't inadvertently step on a mine, we've got a map to the minefield. We help guide you around those. And we say, well, don't do that, because if you do that, here's what's going to happen. And it may not be something you've ever encountered before because you didn't even know it existed. That's why you surround yourself with a team of professionals who has the knowledge, who has the experience, who has the expertise of navigating you through the muddy waters that make up the tax code. That's when it comes to tax reduction. That's what we do every single day, is help people in this nightmarish situation so it doesn't have to be as much of a nightmare. Well, let's tie in our next point, which is estate planning and how we overcome the death taxes. Now, let me clarify a little bit. When I say death taxes, really I'm talking about any imposition of a fee, any imposition of expenses. It doesn't necessarily mean that we're talking about estate taxes, because right now the estate tax is at a level that very few people are finding themselves subject to the estate tax. However, when we start looking at how are you going to pass on your wealth, whenever you pass away, how are you going to pass it on to the next generation? And even as part of that plan, what about business succession planning? Doesn't mean that you have to die before you get out of the business. It may be that you just say, I want to retire, but I've got this thriving business. Well, are you going to sell that business? Or would you like to leave it to a family member? Would you like to have maybe your family member come in and take it over? They may buy it from you. The reality is none of this takes place without a plan in place. So we've got to make sure that we have the right plan. Now, if we back up just a minute and just say the estate planning, I told you earlier, 4 out of every 4 people will die. And again, I know that's not the motivational part of this training video, but it's something that we all have to factor in because we're going to pass away at some point. Now, I tell people all the time, everyone has an estate. As a result, everyone needs a plan for that estate. If you die without a plan, well, guess what? The government has one for you. Now, my guess is you're not going to like their plan. And at the same time, they will like their plan. The reality is you want things to pass according to your wishes, not anyone else's. Well, in order to do that, you've got to have a plan in place. Now, for a lot of people, they say, okay, I'll have a will. Well, a will is much better than having nothing at all. But at the same time, a will is typically going to be subjected to the probate process. And when we say the probate process, what we're talking about is a process set up by the government for the orderly distribution of assets upon death. I got to tell you, at first glance, that doesn't sound so bad. There should be a process set up for the orderly distribution of assets upon death. The challenge I have is with 3 words. Those 3 words are by the government. Because think about it. Is the government known for its efficiency? Hardly. The government's known for bureaucracy. Well, it's no different when it comes to the probate process. There are a lot of steps involved. There are a lot of people involved. The probate court oversees the transfer of your assets. Well, we need to have a plan that we can avoid the probate process. And there are certain strategies that we can implement for certain types of assets that can avoid the probate process. However, when we start getting into businesses and legal entities and maybe rental properties and other assets that are owned in multiple jurisdictions, multiple states, that's where we need a bit more of a complex plan to take care of our complex overall structure. Well, for that, we generally utilize a revocable living trust. Well, that trust for many people is something that's brand new because they think, a trust? I never dreamed I'd need a trust. I thought trusts were only for, multimillionaires, if not billionaires. Well, the reality is the use of this revocable living trust is primarily to avoid probate. That's what you need to make sure that you're able to avoid, because you don't want to have your family having to deal with the probate court and having a delay of receiving your assets for months, if not years. And when I say months, I'm talking about the average length of time for the probate process is 11 to 14 months. That's a long time for your family to have to wait before they get your assets. That's not what you had in mind. That's not what they had in mind. We can bypass this overall process through the use of that revocable living trust. That's what estate planning is all about, making sure that you have a plan that can pass on your wealth to your heirs and beneficiaries as expeditiously and efficiently as possible. Well, we work with people all the time on this. And really that ties in. I want to get your take on this in just a second, Tony, but I want to tie this into this final point, and that is entity structuring. People ask all the time and they say, okay, just tell me what I need. Well, I typically say, I don't know what you need. I don't know anything about your situation, your circumstances, your current structure. I need more information before I can tell you what you need. And anytime I'm telling somebody what they need, it may be based on a snapshot in time. As their business grows, as their situation changes, as their circumstances change, we've got to adapt to that change. And that's where entity structuring comes into play. And that's really what this is all about, is understanding which entities, and most importantly, why. It's not just the what, it's the why. Many times people say, no, I just want to know what to do. Well, no, if you don't understand why you are doing that, it's not going to do you a whole lot of good, because you're not going to really get it. And that's part of what we do at Advanced Tax Group. It's part of what we're trying to do with these videos, is to provide you with the information to make good decisions. Because operating a business is largely about making the right decisions and making sure that you don't destroy yourself if for some reason you made the wrong decision. That's why we're here. That's why we provide this information. Tony, what would you kind of add to what I just shared there?
Yeah, I mean, you're hitting some really big topics, and some stuff that these clients and anybody watching these videos are going to at some point address. You know, when it comes to entities and how it applies to everything we're talking about here, information and the use of that information is so important. So as whether let's say you are working with Advanced Tax Group and Savvy CFO, the reality is getting these things put together. There's a lot of different ways to look at this, and you've heard this in other videos. You know, what should you set up and why you should set it up? You know, the answer that you're probably going to hear from us is, well, it depends. It depends on what you set up, and it depends on why you set it up. You know, if you're talking to JJ, he may be talking to you about setting it up from an asset protection standpoint. If you're talking to me or Tim, we may be talking about it from a tax standpoint. And so what's important and what's so valuable here in this course is we're looking at it from both angles, is, you know, utilizing the entities from both an asset protection and a tax standpoint, because both of those are important factors to making those decisions and tying those into your overall estate plan, to addressing the lid concept that JJ, you were so magically sharing with us today.
Well, thanks for that input, Tony. And, you know, just to kind of wrap things up, I want to circle back to something you said earlier, and that is one of the biggest obstacles that people have is inaction and just failing to take action. And sometimes it's because they don't have the right information, or they want to have every bit of information before they ever make that decision. And sometimes people are afraid to make the wrong choice because they say, well, I don't know if I should do this. I don't know if I should do that. I don't want to make the wrong choice. So they make the most wrong choice, which is no choice. And, you know, I don't know if it was Kierkegaard or Neil Peart who said, if you choose not to decide, you still have made a choice. Actually, that was Neil Peart from the band Rush. And I mentioned that in our choosing your legal structure. And I'm circling back to it again and saying, guys, you got to make a choice, because even if you choose not to decide, you still made a choice. Make a choice to move forward. Structure your business the right way. If you need more guidance on it, talk to us. We'd love to help you. That's part of what these videos do. That's what we do as our business. So take advantage of it. Now, let's kind of wrap up with a summary of what we've covered. We talked about the threats to your wealth building efforts. Those were the lid that is attempting to be placed on your assets, the lawsuits, the income taxes, and the death taxes. We've got to overcome those, take the lid off. We do that by focusing on asset protection, tax reduction, and estate planning. All three of those areas make up the larger overall area of entity structuring. Because to make sure that all three of these are addressed at the same time, what you need is an entity structure, basically a blueprint for how your entity should be structured. And you need to understand it. It's not just enough to have the information of what this is. You need to understand, why do you have this particular entity? What is the purpose of this entity? And then understand how you need to use it. That's what we work with people on a regular basis. That's why we put this whole Savvy Startup video series together, so that you would have the information. Now, we know it can't answer every imaginable question, but that's not the intent. It's to get you the foundation upon which to build. We've done a great job through these other videos. We hope you've enjoyed them, and I hope you enjoyed this video. Tony, any final thoughts that you'd have as we kind of wrap up this additional asset protection planning video?
You know, what I will say is that the concepts that we've talked about today and that JJ's been sharing, these are big concepts that will apply and affect your business. And we just so strongly encourage you to stay with it. As a startup owner, as a founder, as a creator, whatever that business may be, it's hard. What you're doing is very, very impressive. And these are very important components to protecting yourself and helping your business continue to grow and expand. And to do what you're doing and to succeed at this business that you're building, that we've hopefully been part of this journey with you, that takes a lot of grit. It takes a lot of focus and a lot of energy. And we just commend you for doing what you're doing and encourage you to reach out to all of us when you start to hit some of those roadblocks or some of those challenges. That's what we're here for. We love doing what we do and supporting people just like you in this process. And so we don't want you to feel overwhelmed like JJ talked about. We want you to feel empowered. And we're hoping that this information that we're sharing on asset protection and taxes and estate planning is empowering and encouraging for you, not overwhelming and daunting. So, like JJ said, we're here to support you. Don't hesitate to reach out, and we'll do whatever we can to help you in the process.
Speaking of reaching out, I'm going to put this up here again so they have our contact information on, if you want to take things to the next level, you want to learn things in a little more detail, you want to make sure that you're able to implement these strategies, reach out to us. If you have, financial issues that you want to talk about, talk to Tim, talk to Imran, find out, how they can be of assistance, and then let Tony and I know how we can help you to do all that we can with really our specialty, what we teach in these videos and what we do through our business, and that is making sure that we help you cover your assets.